Carla Nappi.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. If I talk like this? If I talk like this? Yeah. Like this? Okay, so I'll just kind of go like this throughout the time. So thank you so much to Dan for inviting me to be here. This is not necessarily going to be explicitly about sovereignty until and unless we make it so. So I invite you as part of your sort of grasp your creative agency in Q&A if you'd like, and translate what we're going to be talking about today, which is going to in part be about translation, it's going to in part be about movement and prepositions and Manchu, into concerns about sovereignty, and we can transform this along the way. What I will be talking about is what you see here. So I'm a historian, okay? Whatever that means, we could talk about what that means later on. Perhaps you might be asking yourself what that means after this talk. And right now, what I'm really interested in is writing with and writing about the problem of materiality and objects, okay, as a problem. Now, for me, that takes a particular form. Instead of trying to assume a concept of material objects and reading that back into my documents, my archive, so assuming that I know and that we know what a material object is, that concept is consistent across space and time, and we can just take it and plop it down and use it as a lens through which to understand historical phenomena. What I'm trying to do is treat materiality as something that emerges from an archive and as something that's kind of ephemeral and locally specific. So I'm trying to do that by producing, or at least by trying to produce, and simultaneously trying to figure out what it might look like to produce an archive of material relations. Okay? What does that mean? So the particular field in which I'm trying to do this is Manchu studies. And here's what's going to happen today. What I'm basically going to be doing is taking a very particular problem or concept, right? The problem of prepositions, prepositional history, relationality, and the way that material existence and material experience comes out of that. And I'm going to be trying to locate that in a very particular example or model, both so that I can communicate to you exactly what I'm talking about, sort of how I got here, why I got here, and also so that we can move from, here's me talking about concepts, let's just stay at that level and sort of go like this, and move to showing you, at least trying to show you, what a concrete example of practicing the kind of practice that I'm talking about might look like. And this is really important. It's very crucial for me. I'm not just trying to talk and write and understand about history in here. This isn't just a critical intervention into the concept of history and the concepts of historiography. This is really about trying to figure out a way to motivate a practice of history. Okay? This is about material practice. This is about what does it look like, what does it materially involve to tell stories, and how might approaching that practice in a very different, a very new way, at least new with respect to my practice, really change the kinds of stories that it's possible to tell and the way that it's possible to work with documents and to work with really anything that you use as your material basis with which to tell stories, whether those are stories that you and that I identify as historical stories, or whether they're other kinds of stories, and whether those traces take the form of pages, and you're going to see a whole lot more of this in a little bit, or whether those traces take the form of pens, or breath, or sounds like this, or images. And we'll talk about all of that to some extent later. Okay, so the particular field that I'll talk about today is Manchu. And this right here, what you're looking at, is one page of a 600+ page document that I'll be guiding you through and opening up for you in a little bit. What you see here, this is an image. Okay, obviously it's an image. And you'll see there are terms here that are labeling parts of the image. These terms are keyed back to this up here. And what this is 4 lines of a script called Manchu that I'll be explaining a little bit more about soon. And what that's doing is it's telling you and describing what these parts that are being labeled are. This is a page from a book about anatomy. But what I hope to convince you of, or at least open up the possibility of thinking about by the end of our hour or so today, is that it's actually potentially, if you read it in a different way, not a book about anatomy at all. What if it's a book about relationships and prepositional attitudes. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a bit. All right, so here is another page of Manchu. What is Manchu? Does anyone in here perhaps read Manchu? Maybe. Okay, I know at least one of you is actually quite expert in reading and working with Manchu. But for the rest of you, anybody else ever read or worked with Manchu documents? Anyone have any idea what I'm talking about when I say Manchu? Excellent. This is what I was hoping, that at least you've learned a little bit about China. So in what was called the Qing Dynasty, and you'll see that often written either CH apostrophe ING, or you'll see it written QING, Qing Dynasty. This ran from the middle of the 17th century all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. In this period, and one of the reasons that those of us who are China historians, who are interested in empire, ethnicity, colonialism, colonial history, imperialism, are so interested, translation, right, are so interested in this period, is that Qing was ruled by a group of people known as Manchu, okay, M-A-N-C-H-U. Now the Manchus had, as part of their sort of instruments of rule, they had a spoken language, and we can talk about oral footnote, okay, so we're down here now. If you want, during Q&A, you can talk about the genesis of the nature of the Manchu as a group of people, the sort of issues of race and ethnicity. Who are we talking about when we talk about Manchu? But for now, I'm just going to table that and move to the script. Add a footnote. So as part of their instruments of rule, the Manchu people, the rulers and their scribes, created a written language that was based, a written script, okay, that was based on what was then the Mongolian script. And again, there are lots of things that we can talk about in the footnote about the genesis of that script if you want. Okay, so this is what the script looked like. It starts up here, and you read it down, and then you go across and you read it like that, right? Manchu script. It is, well, I can tell you more about it later if you want. Okay, this is the official language of the Qing Empire, all right? Tons of documentary materials exist in Manchu. This was in no way just a kind of side language. This is in no way a mere footnote to Chinese history. This was absolutely a crucial documentary language of Qing rule, okay? All right, so Qing, what are we talking about when we're talking about the Qing? Random web map, people. Random web map that I stole from somebody else. Basically, this is a random map from about 1820. When we're talking about the Qing, this is what we're talking about, right? Ooh, yellow, yellow, light yellow, deep yellow over here. This is important because during the Qing, the empire that had been China doubles in size, okay? Doubles in size. At its height, the Qing is actually larger than the People's Republic of China is today. So really, really interesting, really crucial. That's where we are on the map as of 1820. Those are the dates of the Qing period. Everybody got it? Yes? Okay. So Manchu as a script, even though this was used in China, there's a lot of influence on Manchu by its proximity to and its relationships with Chinese. Manchu is not Chinese. Manchu is not just a version of Chinese, okay? And this is just to show you the differences. This is a page, this is the same page I showed you before, from a book that was a Manchu translation of a Chinese text that was made to help people memorize drugs and their qualities. So it was a rhymed text, it was a poem, it was sort of like King Philip chases orangutans for game sport. Anybody else heard that? Is that like a US thing? That's a US thing. Kingdom, file, class, order, family, genus, species. King Philip chases orangutans for game sport. Mnemonic devices, we love them. We use them to memorize body parts. And if you were in early modern China, you would use them to memorize drug qualities. So here's how you use chamomile. Here's when you would want to use snake venom, etc. There was a rhymed text that did that in Chinese, and this is one page of a Manchu translation of that. You see up there, this is the name in Chinese of the drug. This is the same sound in Manchu. Okay, so just to show you the difference here and the distinction between the script and what we're talking about when we talk about Manchu. All right, so why would anybody care about this? Why would I care? Why would you care? You should care. You should care because it's inherently interesting. And that's also kind of why I care. But I also care because I'm in what's called science studies. Okay, I'm interested in the history of bodies, the history of plant bodies, animal bodies, rock bodies, human bodies, all kinds of bodies, rock bodies. That's a good title. I'm going to use that. And the reason why Manchu is particularly interesting, if you're interested in that kind of thing, is that in the late 17th, early to late 18th centuries, Manchu was used as a language by Jesuits, by people at the court, by Chinese scholars, to translate material, textual material, concepts, images, ideas that had not been in Manchu, that was from Latin or French or Chinese or lots of other languages, Russian, into Manchu, into the Qing court. Put another way, Manchu became, in what I consider to be the early modern period, 17th, 18th centuries, or late early modern, it was a really important language for translating knowledge about bodies, okay? Which means it was a really important language if you're interested in translation and communication in the early modern world around, knowledge about plants and animals and bodies and health, etc., right? So Manchu becomes really, really important for the translation of knowledge about bodies, drugs, plants, animals, stones, materials, diseases across early modern Eurasia. This is the Manchu title of the text, because I know all of you after this are going to run out and be like, I need to get my hands on a copy of that. It is so amazing. So there are lots of different kinds of texts that are available if you're someone who's interested in these issues, in the use of Manchu as a medium of translation around and with bodies. And they include lots of different kinds of documents. I'm going to give you just a thumbnail, quick and dirty. Here's one. There's one. Isn't that cool? This is one. There's one, until we get finally to our guy with the nose job up there, and we're going to stay with him for a while. All right, so in the 17th and 18th, a little bit of a snatch into the early 19th centuries. Here's at least some range of what you can expect to find. Texts about drugs and their qualities. And we talked a little bit about this. This is a text produced during what's called the Qing Period, Kangxi, right? If you look this up in at least one popular romanization, he was an emperor. He was an emperor who was really, really involved in Jesuit use of Manchu to translate stuff about bodies. Now, this is really cool, among other things, if you're interested in music and rhyme and rhythm, because the translators who produced this Manchu version of this mnemonic text that was rhymed and that had a certain rhythm for memorizing drug qualities, in some ways tried to evoke, if not to reproduce, then at least to sort of create an experience of rhythm and rhyme in the Manchu, right? That sort of exists at the same time as the way rhythm and rhyme worked in the Chinese without duplicating it. So put another way, this is a translator or translators saying, hey, this text rhymed, had rhythm, there was a kind of music that enabled memorization in this text. Let's create music in Manchu using the qualities of that language. And I just think that's just pretty cool. Okay, there are anatomical texts, and we're going to look at this in much more detail in a little bit, early 18th century. There are also poems about plants and animals and their relationships with people, and this is a little page of poems from the guy that I like to think of as the Rodney Dangerfield of translators in the Qing. This is somebody named Jack Dan, who I know one of you is doing awesome research on in this room. He was not only a translator of short stories like ghost stories, etc. He also wrote a collection of what have come to be really, really interesting poems in Manchu. He flourished late 18th to the mid 19th centuries, and a lot of his poems actually evoke not just sort of ways of thinking about and writing about and imagining and feeling the natural world, but also evoke voices of natural objects, okay? And we can talk about that. If you want later, some of this has to do with onomatopoeia. Like, woof, bark, sound like words for that. And so that's a whole other part of the story. Ask me about onomatopoeia and how to translate them later, because it's really cool. I'll actually talk about it in a minute. Anyway, so he was really interested in, it seems, onomatopoeia, and his poems have a lot of ways of voicing the natural world in Manchu poetic language. But that's not all. There were also multilingual works on materia medica, and here's just to give you a little taste. Here's an image of prayer beads, rosary beads that were made out of a particular kind of wood in a Tibetan text about Mongolian materia medica from the early to mid 19th century. And this is interesting if you're interested in Manchu, because as you see here, this is a whole other story. Here is one kind of prayer bead. Here's another. This is about using them medicinally, which is itself just kind of really cool, Buddhism and medicine. But also you'll see there's a Chinese name for these, Tibetan transliteration of the Chinese name, and then you have Mongolian and Manchu versions of this name as well. So that happens, and that's interesting. There are also topically organized dictionaries like this one, which include entire sections of terms, not just devoted to plant terminology, body terminology, but there's a whole section of these devoted to sounds, and I will get to that in a moment. There's also a whole section devoted to expletives. So for example, if you're a historian of science interested in, say, how did Manchu writers use the natural world to curse people off? And then how did translators decide that a particular curse word or a particular gesture of expletive, like verbal expletive gesture, was translated into 4 other languages? Basically, how do you, and this is the equivalent of writing a dictionary that has an entire section devoted to versions of up yours, and then saying, for each one, here's how you translate it into Tibetan and Mongolian and Uyghur and Chinese, but whole sections of these, and a lot of them, this is why I'm bringing this up in a discussion of history of science, a lot of them evoke the natural world. Bones, putrid things, rotting things, icky things, buggy things, okay? So this is a page from a section of a particularly influential, particularly interesting dictionary from the 18th century that is sort of devoted to collecting and translating sounds in this section. And what you see here are 4 onomatopoeias, okay, sounds of objects and bodies voicing themselves rendered into 4 languages. All right, so if we just look at this for a moment so I can convey the coolness and the relevance of this to ultimately prepositional history, which you'll see. Here is ha up here, okay? Each column is a column of equivalent, or when somebody decided were equivalent terms, ha, and then you have Tibetan. You have different Manchu renderings of how the Tibetan is spelled, what it sounds like when you pronounce it, because they're not the same thing. Mongolian, Uyghur, the Manchu for how the Uyghur is pronounced, and a Chinese explanation. This is a sound made when you breathe on frozen or cold objects. A sound made when you breathe on frozen or cold objects. Can't even. And there's tons and tons of these. So this is, if we had 3 hours tonight, I would be talking with you for an hour about the ways that voicing onomatopoeias creates a kind of relationship between the physical world and the human body, and the way that that voicing and that breath and that sound acts as a medium for creating relationships. We can talk about that later if you want, but I'll just put that out there. That's one of the really interesting things going on. Okay, but back to this, and back to our guy with the nose job. Okay, so I've been especially lately focusing on this text, and let's make him a little bit bigger. To try to use it, this is another page, okay, from that same text that the nervous system guy came from, to try to use it as an archive of what I'm calling prepositional relationships or prepositional attitudes. Okay, so here we come to prepositional history. So what do I mean by that, and how do you take a book on anatomy and transform it into an archive, first of all, and not just an archive, but an archive not of hair and bones, but an archive of prepositional relationships. And what does that mean? Well, let's look to see what that means. But first, what's happening here in this image that you're going to be seeing a lot more of is a version of what was happening in the other one. You'll see these Manchu terms up there, right? Gya. Right, where's Gya? So Gya up there, like right over here, you see Gya, okay? This right here, and this is an explanation of what that part is, and we sort of move from here to here. Okay, so how is this an archive of prepositional relationships? Well, let me tell you a little bit more about the text. You want to know, right? Where's this? Yes, you should. Let's see. So this is a page from a text that's usually referred to as the Manchu Anatomy, and I'm going to refer to it by that name for the rest of the talk. However, the Manchu name, because I know you want to know, is that. Okay? Say it with me. Okay. It roughly translated the imperially commissioned complete record of the body. Now, interestingly, some of you might notice, that sounds like the Chinese. This must be a Manchu translation of a Chinese text, right? Wrong. There was no Chinese version of this. It was only produced in Manchu. This was produced, I'll actually show you who this was produced by. This is probably produced by some Jesuits, their Manchu language tutors, Chinese scholars, and the emperor. So what do I mean by that? The Kangxi emperor personally requested to see every 10 pages so that he could correct the grammar in the book. Can you imagine? The emperor requested every 10 pages, and we actually have a copy of this manuscript with the Kangxi emperor's grammatical corrections on it. Crazy. But basically, usually what you'll have this guy in particular credited with the authorship of this text. It was much more, I'm sure, of a collaborative relationship, and it was produced at the court of this emperor I mentioned before, the Kangxi emperor. Now, not a lot of people study Manchu, okay? I know, it's surprising, but not a lot of people study Manchu. It's not very widely taught. And so in scholarship on this text, what people have done is what you would think is reasonable to do. So for example, hey, look at the images. Those are really interesting. Some of them actually look like images from contemporary or slightly earlier European language texts. Let's look at that. So if you look through this text, what you'll see is there are a number of images that look either kind of vaguely like some contemporary texts that would have been in the hands of, or at least in the minds of, would have been around the Jesuits who were making this translation at the time, and some of them look really, really, really like those texts, okay? You can sort of see some of these images were probably copied. Not all of them were, and images like this, you'll see people who are not working with the Manchu, but just working with the images, will look at facial features, the kind of hair, the kind of dress that some of these figures are wearing. You can see the figure here, and try to understand this in the context of contemporary fashion, ethnicity, and the way some of these faces and body parts in this text are described, etc., etc. Now, what I would like to do for the rest of the time, and what I have been doing, is asking, what if we read the book, right? What if we don't just look at the images, but actually read the text? What's going on there? And it turns out when you do that, it's really, really interesting. So that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this. All right, now instead of treating this as a book about anatomy, I'm trying to do something really different with it. So what if, okay, I'll show you kind of what can happen when you do this. What if, rather than reading this looking for noses, okay, for example, I instead read for the kinds of relationships that noses produce, okay? Things go in your nose, things come out your nose, things sort of, if you think about the anatomy of the sort of architecture of your nose, there are insides and outsides, there are next tos, there are widths. What if, instead of saying, that's a nose, we say, that's a space for producing withness, inness, onness, throughness. Now, what if I read the entire text that way, such that the book becomes a collection of translations and renderings of kinds of proximity, kinds of nearness and farness, of prepositional attitudes, of with and without, on and upon, etc. Now, these are important, I want to suggest, because they're elements of experience that we tend to take for granted. Okay, these are the words in, to, from, with, that we tend to look beyond when we're actually looking at the content of a sentence, the content of a document. We're often reading for the nouns, we're reading for the places, we're reading for the verbs and the actions. We're not reading often, at least not in my experience, for the tos, the froms, the withs, the suffixes, the postpositions and prepositions. Now, there are also elements of history and historical thinking that we tend to take for granted. And I want to argue that if we really make them central to the way we think about history, we'd not only be telling different kinds of stories, but also generating very different kinds of archives to do so, right? So that's where this comes from. Prepositional history, prepositioning history. This is about moving away from a history of objects and toward a way of writing about materiality as a process, okay? And as a process that depends on and creates relationships. So again, rather than saying, I'm going to do a history of cups, I'm going to look for a cup and situate this in history, what if this is a history of this feeling, of on top ofness, of inside ofness, of withoutness, right, of throughness. So this whole thing was, on some level, inspired by a quotation from William James that I kind of got to by way of a Latour piece in this book on speculative realism, and none of those names matter if you're not interested in those names, but I just want to kind of give you this moment of inspiration that for me was very much transformative. There's not a conjunction or a preposition, and hardly an adverbial phrase, syntactic form, inflection of voice in human speech that does not express some shading or other of relation, which we at some moment actually feel to exist between the larger objects of our thought. We ought to say a feeling of and, a feeling of if, a feeling of but. Whenever I say this to people, a feeling of but, you said a feeling of but, a feeling of by is quite as readily as we say a feeling of blue, a feeling of cold, okay? So this is really, this last part, a feeling of and, a feeling of if, this is really kind of where I'm coming from, okay? What if what would it look like to write a history of if, or a history of and, a history of but? She said but. All right. So terms like to and from, with and above, on, and others, these are some of the most important linguistic technologies that we use, and really kind of perceptual technologies. They orient and they move bodies in time and space. They create intimacies, okay, among objects. They bring them together, they tear them apart. They create communities by situating objects relative to one another. And by objects, I'm sort of speaking loosely here. Inside, outside, above, below, possessing, possessed by, before, after. Different prepositions accomplish this in different ways. So for example, with, it creates proximity, it creates nearness of various sorts. If raises conditions and counterfactuals. It allows a kind of time travel, kind of lurching us into the future or back into the past. If is very much about, and I'm very interested in this right now, about a kind of simultaneity and time travel at the same time. We can talk about that later if you'd like. But suggests alternatives. It removes things, it places things outside. By positions things in particular spaces and times, it creates motion. That's actually really, that becomes really, really important. The sort of the creation of motion and the creation of directional motion in particular, I think is a really important theme that speaks to a lot of what a lot of historians are interested in right now, insofar as we talk about circulation and movement and itinerancy. By specifies conditions of means and method, by way of something, by means of something. And we can go on, okay? We can go on and on with this. Now, taken together, prepositions make mere juxtaposition, okay? Mere collocation, take a narrative shape, right? They produce directionality in time and space, and they create movement. In doing so, prepositions are absolutely key to storytelling, historical or otherwise, as I mentioned before. They allow, again, mere co-presence to tell a story. And I'm using here preposition sort of loosely to stand for all kinds of verbal and grammatical technologies in all kinds of languages that don't always come before the terms that they modify. So preposition here doesn't just mean things that come before a word that they modify in the sense that we're familiar with from English. I mean a kind of broader category of prepositional attitudes and the kinds of technologies that evoke them and enact them. So focusing on the kind of work that prepositions do can actually, I want to argue and I want to show you in a moment, refigure the kind of history that we do. Now this is not necessarily by doing a history of prepositions, right? It's not what I'm going to do for the rest of my time today. but instead by trying to write a history that focuses on the kinds of relationships that prepositions create. Again, withness, inness, nearness, farness, and of relations that produce material experience more broadly. Okay, so that's what this is going to be, a history and an archive for producing a history of relations that produce material experience. So how might that happen? Like, what might that look like? Show me the money, Nappi, Bowski. I don't know where I got that from. It's late, and I use a bowler in my previous life. True story. Big Lebowski. Most of you have seen that, right? That's you can please go watch that tonight if you haven't. At least to start with, okay, so let's consider this by looking back at the Manchu anatomy. And here again, I'd like to suggest the nose is not just a nose, a flap of skin, and I'm going to talk to you about skin. Isn't just a flap of skin. Instead, they're going to be tools that generate prepositional relationships and allow us to see these attitudes I've been talking about of proximity and distance in the text. All right, so let's dig in. Now, this is actually from a much larger text that was originally in 2 volumes. I'm going to blitz you through what was in there before we dig into the noses and dig into the skin. Their first volume was called The Upper Part. What was in the upper part? What could you find there if you read? I am glad that I asked. In place of you, I will show you. There was a discussion of how the body is put together. And as I go through these really briefly, I'm going to be showing you an image that comes from each one of these sections, just so that you can have the flavor of both the variety of kinds of images that you can see here, and those of you who might be more familiar with the history of anatomy in European language texts, some of these for you might seem more familiar visually, and some of them are not going to be so familiar. And so I'm in part showing you these images so that you can see the range here, at least a little bit. Okay, there was, the red doesn't show up very well. That's okay, because I'll read it for you. There was a section on the head and neck, a section on the shoulder and arm, a section on the breast and belly. There was sections on the lower back, the lower leg, discussions of internal organs. So there was a special section for the stomach and spleen, kidneys and bladder, etc. And a section devoted to the fluids of the body. And for historians or anyone really interested in flow, in histories of flow and histories of movement, histories of substances that create space by their flow and by their movement, this is a really interesting section. Blood is blood, and spirit, suktun is the Manchu equivalent or rough translation of the Chinese qi. Okay, so qigong, the qi, right? That sort of, this is a section on flows of liquids in the body. Then there was a lower part of this text. I'm not going to talk about it, but just to show you the kinds of things that if you wanted to read this, you would be reading about. History of medicine and anatomy in Manchu, diseases of various body parts, diseases of lots of different parts of the body, fevers, epidemic diseases, etc. And there are medical prescriptions in this text as well. All right, so I want to focus in on the head and the neck. Now, the head and the neck are particularly interesting, okay, in part because if you're interested in the history of sensation, or a history of perception, a history of smell and taste and touch and sound and sight, this is a really good section to look for that. In the space of the head, there's a lot of discussions in the discussions of the space of the head of how and why sensation happens. Okay, and we can get to that later perhaps. All right, so if you're interested in the ways that the authors of this text are dealing with problems of translation that relate to sensation and sensory perception, or more generally are trying to explain the ways that built structures create sensory experience. So if anyone's interested in architecture and the history of architecture, you can read this as a kind of architectural treatise, I would argue, especially an architectural treatise that talks about the ways that sensory experience and bodily experience come out of built structures. Okay, this is a great place to find moments that are resonant. So there's a lot of discussions in here of various kinds of parts, okay? But I want to focus in on this one for now. This is our guy with the nose job. Oforo be gisura henge. Discussion of the nose, the oforo. Now, here is my big point about the nose, and I'm going to take you through why and how this happens. The nose is not just a nose. This is not a physical thing necessarily, but also, and I'll sort of ask you to reorient toward this, it's a creator and mediator of relationships. The nose is a creator and mediator of relationships. One way this happens, number one, the nose mediates relationships between a human body and the material environment that the body consumes and perceives. And so if you look through this, ways that this happens, this section talks about the two holes in the nose that distinguish foul from pleasant odors, and it talks about the importance of the nostrils for helping you smell things before eating and drinking them to check that they're safe to consume. So these are the kinds of concerns in this text, and these are both, I would argue, examples of this part of the text doing this, okay? Mediating relations, again, between a human body and the material environment consumed and perceived by that body. That's number one. The second way, the nose creates relationships. It mediates relations between different shapes and sizes of the human body in time and space. Okay, so this is a kind of time travel thing. And this is how this happens. The text talks about variations in the size and shape of the human nose, including which are more conducive to breathing. Okay? According to this text, if a nose is short and flat, not only does it look really weird, but also when breathing, the person can't breathe right. Okay? If it's long and high, it looks good, and breathing is easy. So there's kind of a physical aesthetics happening here too. There's a kind of a bodily aesthetics. It describes the skin of the nose and its relative oiliness. It describes how the nose changes or not when somebody puts on weight and how it moves over the course of a lifetime. So according to this text, over the course of a person's life, the nose actually migrates in the space of the face, which is also, I think, really interesting. Okay? Now, and we could talk about details. So this is the second way. Again, I want to argue the nose is mediating relations. It's mediating relations, and I want to sort of categorize this as between different shapes and sizes of the human body in time and space, all right? Number three, and this is the last one for the nose, and then we're going to move to skin. The nose also mediates relationships, and this one I'm really, really interested in. So definitely pay attention to this one. It mediates relationships and likenesses, okay? So this becomes a story of likenesses and equivalence that come from habitual proximity to other things in the world, okay? So what's happening here? I'll show you what's happening here. All right, the bones of the nose. So here's the thing. In Manchu literature, at this point, there aren't necessarily special names for the bones of the various parts of the body, right? I mean, we think about ears, we think about hammer and anvil, etc. At this point, in the text that at least the Jesuits are translating into Manchu, there's special names for the bone that goes like this, the bones that go like this. Those names don't exist in Manchu necessarily, so they have to basically be producing these names, okay? So how do you, right, so you're a translator, and you are trying to take a body, so you work in language English, and you are trying to translate into language, start looking at your life, okay? Now, in the text, in language, start looking at your life, you're reading it, and they don't have the same body parts as we have in English, okay? So you have to translate a book on the anatomy for readers of this start looking at your life language, whereas they don't have the same, like, how do you translate lung if you don't have a body in your language that has a lung? What do? Well, what they do is they decide, you know, we're going to describe this in terms of what they're like, okay? What it's like. So that readers in start looking at your life language, or Manchu, okay, is my sort of analogy, can start to understand, because we'll describe it by likening them to something else. So I might say, hello, speaker of start looking at your life. You don't have lungs, but what about a goopy thing that's sort of in the shape of a bean, but really big, right? Now, what does that mean? If I'm assuming that you, as a start looking at your life language user, are going to recognize the term bean, and are going to recognize sort of big and small, right? I'm assuming that in your language and in your context, you have beans and you have bigness and smallness, even if you don't have lungs. So this is part of what happens here, and it's really interesting, right? So the bones of the nose are like small leaves on a branch. They decide to use these analogies to figures of the material world that they think might be more familiar, like teeth on a saw, like picks used to play string instruments. There's also, the bones of the nose are also described in terms of various tools used in animal husbandry, wooden hooks used for leading camels and cows, bird traps. So this is really interesting from the perspective of relationships, because what's happening here is these translators are creating relationships through the nose between sort of bodily experience and sort of objects that are in habitual proximity to those bodies in the rest of the world. Okay, so we have really interesting moments here where the translators, again, are trying to describe physical characteristics in Manchu that don't otherwise necessarily exist in this context in Manchu. And when this happens, again, they resort to analogy and the use of terms that are better known from other non-anatomical contexts. What you also see here are terms that are taken and used to describe the built spaces of the body, and especially the face, that come specifically from architectural contexts, okay? Terms that you would otherwise see to describe roofs of built structures in Manchu, walls, fences, bridges. All of this kind of built structure vocabulary is taken up and used to describe the way space is organized in the face and in the body, and I just think that's really interesting. All right, now this also happens with the second example that I want to super briefly take you to because it's inherently interesting and you should just be interested in it. And this is skin. All right, there's a lot of skin in this book. I'm just going to show you a tiny little flap of it. And to start, this is again a picture. Here are descriptions of stuff that should be pointed to if you could see, like right here, you can sort of see it's really vague, like up there, this pia. You see, like you can sort of imagine there's a little pia over there, but it's sort of bent, you know, my shirt's riding up. But that's okay, because it's about proximity and relations, up and down, on and off. What's going on here? Yeah, okay, the surface skin of the body. Okay, and in Manchu, this is be oilorgi suku inu. Okay, I know you all know that, but just in case. And this is also describing the inside of the skin once it's been removed from the body. Now, why am I showing you this? It's interesting inherently, but also to make a point. Even this tiny moment, not from the narrative, sort of the major narrative of the text, but just from the description of the images, brings out some of the major ways that skin is discussed in a way that sort of speaks to our interest here, my interest, and I'm assuming it's your interest as well, in proximal relationships and prepositional relationships. Manchu skin was all about, I think, creating relationships between insides and outsides, enabling movement and translation across boundaries and membranes, and across surfaces and environments. And like the nose, the skin also mediates relationships and likenesses that come from habitual proximity to other entities in the world. Now, again, when the composers of this text are translating kinds of skin that they seem to worry that readers won't recognize because they aren't already terms and concepts in Manchu literature, they resort to relating skin to other objects and notions that they assume, I'm assuming that they assume, right, would be more familiar to their readers, okay? So animal bodies, snakes molting, okay, the sort of description of snakes that molt is used here to describe what happens when the skin is warmed and blisters. And it's compared, also skin here is compared with wild animal skin and hair and bird skin and feathers. So one of the things that you see in this text that's really interesting is the translators are trying to render this idea of like layers of skin and then multiple layers of fat that come underneath it, which is just not something that you find in Manchu texts at this time. And they're like, well, how do we describe this? Well, snakes molting and bird feathers and animal hair. And so you can sort of put together this really interesting archive of likenesses that, again, and by doing this, they're not just assuming readers will recognize this. By putting this into the text, they are now creating relationships between physical human skin and its layers and bird feathers, okay, and snakes molting. Yes. siren to mark the truth and the interestingness. Okay, skin is also compared with clothing. So if clothing protects the wearer against hot and cold, so does skin. So here you have not just a relationship created between skin and clothing, you have skin being invoked as something that creates a barrier between warm and cold and a relationship between warm and cold. There's this great moment where there's an explanation of the formation of skin in the womb, okay, by analogizing it to what happens when you take a dish of cold milk, or a dish of hot milk, and put it out in a cold area, okay? It forms a kind of a skin on top, a sort of a, this is how skins form. Great. There's also a description of sort of layers of skin and how communication happens through the layers of skin by analogizing skin to human cognition, okay, intelligence and thought and reason. And so their explanation for how sensation happens through the layers of the skin is made by invoking powers of intelligence and thought and reason and giving it to skin. So it's just really interesting. Okay, so what is the take home here? If you read beyond the anatomical text as mere description, okay, and I've just given you kind of tiny little pieces of this, and if you start to see it as a kind of archive of relationships, it actually becomes a different kind of text, right? Now it becomes an archive of different kinds of relations here, and these are just the ones that I've shown you. The sort of relations between the human body and the material environment, different shapes and sizes of the body in time and space, and also likenesses that come from proximity. Now, all of these relations enable a kind of sensory power. Okay, so I think this is another thing. The power of recognition, sort of smelling and food safety, a sense of when something is off, the power to distinguish, etc. And this is really important because what you can start to do when you acknowledge this, okay, when you read the section on the nose or the section of the skin, for example, not as sort of the nose physical thing and the skin physical thing, and you start to look specifically for where relationships are being produced, okay, and in particular where relationships that seem to generate sensory experience are being produced, you can look at the language that's used to do that. So for example, if there's language using the term adali, like, a term that you can use, it's a kind of postposition, I think. It's the equivalent of what I'm calling a preposition in Manchu, that makes things like each other. Then you can go from there and say, okay, where else in this text is that term used? Where else is likeness used? And you can start making a list or making an archive of likeness. And then look at that archive and see, okay, what emerges from this? And just tell very, very different kinds of stories, okay? So this is really about taking a book that we think we know how to read, making it into something new, and I think telling very different stories from it. So I want to point to the importance here, and we're now kind of coming toward the end of my talking, at least, of translated bodies, okay, of the treatment of the body as a kind of built space that's inhabited, okay, literally and figuratively, by bodily and environmental substances, and the sort of the architecture of the spaces of the body are creating possibilities of perceptual and sensory experience, okay, and this is happening through and by looking particularly for terms like with, like on, like in, or sort of terms that are doing that kind of work, okay, and we could sort of, we could talk about this in much more detail. I've talked a little bit about the nose. There are names of bones and muscles in the nose that are Manchu terms for pillars and walls and other components of built structures. And this is also true. We could look, if we had lots of energy and lots of coffee and like 7 more hours, we could look at the way this is happening in the ear. We could look at the way this is happening in the voice box. There's some really, really interesting discussions here of the way that the esophagus, the bones of the voice box and the sort of bones in this area are actually producing and enabling the production of sound and of material experience and of voicing. We could talk about the eyes and the architecture of the eyes. It's another really interesting moment here. Also, I just really like showing you this because it's a super gross picture. And it's 8 p.m. and you need something like this at 8 p.m. on a Monday. All right, so we have the Manchu anatomy as architecture. The body is a built space made of component parts, each with outsides and insides, interior and exterior surfaces and spaces. They're related to each other, they're mutually defined by another. And within and through these spaces, the self breathes and lives and really exists in proximity and in relationship to the rest of the world. Okay? So the body here is not just a kind of architecture, but also, and related to that, an archive of relationships. Okay, so what have we done here, coming to the end? We've thought about language and material experience. We've thought about materiality in terms of relationships and likenesses that come from proximity and sort of relations to other entities in the world. And it's these material relationships that orient us and that orient the bodies that I've been talking about in space, okay? And sort of these material relationships that create space as a kind of habitat that we can move in and dwell in. So here at the end of this exploration, or at least at this moment in our collective exploration, we're left with the body as an archive of relationships that mediate and enable the translation of sensory experience. And for me, this is really important because what this allows me to do is to start to read and to write a history of bodily experience and materiality as a history of perceptual relationships, without saying, this is it, like, I'm going to assume objects and materials and read them into the text. I'm trying to see how material and sensory relationships come out of the text if you start looking for places of likeness and withness and throughness, okay? So it becomes an archive of stuff, kinds of actions like this. And that's where I'm gonna leave you, so thank you. I'm happy to talk about like any of this stuff and anything that I said under the table or that I didn't say at all, or like if you wanna talk about sovereignty, we could do that too. So thank you.